This video is going to be going over how to do some cleanup in Nuke using 2D and 3D techniques. If you watched the 3D camera tracking tutorial, you will already recognize this setup. This is the shot that I did the camera track on for that example. And in this video, what we're going to be doing is removing these tracking markers from the back wall. I'm going to cover a few different ways of doing this, both in 2D and 3D, because it's always really good to know a few different techniques. That way, if you have a specific situation where one doesn't work, you can just pull something else out the bag. So let's start with the 2D one. Basically, what we want to do is track all of these points, and then what we can do is either paint them out and apply the tracking to the paintwork, or we can do something like apply the tracking onto a transform and move some of these pixels on top of this tracking marker. So let's take a look. The first thing to do is to add a tracker node, obviously. Plug this into the footage, and then I'm going to hold Control and Alt and click on one of the trackers to add a tracking marker. A good tracking tip that lots of beginners don't know about is you can just track one channel, and it can sometimes make it easier to find contrast. So for example, if I start pressing R, G and B and cycle through the red, green and blue channels, you can see the blue channel has significantly more contrast between the pieces of tape that I put on the wall and the actual white of the wall. And so in the tracker node in the settings, if I turn off red and green, we can just track the blue channel, which will make the tracking more accurate. So I'm going to go back to the tracker tab. I'm going to make the tracker a bit smaller just because the tracking markers are pretty small in the shot. And then you can either press the track forward button up here or press V on the keyboard, which is the shortcut, and it will start tracking. I don't expect to have to do much manual tracking on this because I'm not moving the camera too much. So I'm just going to watch it as it goes through and pray that I don't have to intervene at any point. When it gets to the end, we then go back to the start of the track. I'm going to press Z, which is the shortcut for track backwards, or you can press this button up here. Okay, so that's finished. Now I can use this to apply it to some of the cleanup. The first thing I could do is paint out the tracking marker. So if I press P, which is the shortcut for the roto paint node, plug this into my footage, I can come over here to the clone tool, and you hold down Shift and click and drag to change the radius of the tool. And then if you hold Control and drag, it will show you the area you're cloning the pixels from. So the grey one, I can't move my mouse over it because it moves with the mouse. But the grey one here is where the pixels are being cloned from, and the white one is where you're actually drawing. So for example, if I make this a bit bigger, I often turn the opacity up here down to something like 0.1, so it's a bit softer. And then you can literally just paint over it like this, and that gets rid of the tracking marker nicely. If you turn the gamma down a bit in the viewport, it helps with painting to see if it's actually as smooth as it looks. So you can see there I actually cloned a bit that was probably a bit too light. So if I undo that, I can grab a bit that's more of a similar color like this. That's probably still too dark actually. Try this bit. There we go. That's a pretty good match. And then I can reset the gamma, and that looks pretty good. Now with a rotor paint node, if you go to the next frame, the paintwork disappears. So what you have to do is add a frame hold node, which is basically like a freeze frame. Then what I would want to do is cut it out. So I've just got a little circle for where the tracking marker is. So if I disable the rotor paint node by hitting D, I can see where it is. Then I'm going to press O to add a roto node, and I'm just going to draw a little shape around it so that I can cut it out. Then I'm going to add a merge node, plug the B input into the frame hold and the A into the roto. And then I'm going to set the operation in the merge node to mask, which is going to cut it out. And if I select the rotor node, hit B to add a blur node and turn it up a bit, we can feather the edge of that slightly. And if I re-enable the rotor paint node, you can see I now have this small patch that can go over where the tracking marker is. Then the next step from here would be to take the tracker node, unplug it, and then we're going to plug it in underneath the patch that we've made. And then in the transform tab, I'm going to set transform to match move. And once that's done, the patch will actually start to move with the tracker, as you can see. It's important to make sure that your reference frame is set to the same frame you did the painting on. So for me, it's 1, so it is actually right. But let's say I did my painting on frame 19. I would want to make sure that my reference frame in the tracker is also set to 19. And that just means the starting point from the track is the same as where you made the cleanup. So now what I can do is merge this over my original footage. So if I add a merge node and plug this in here, and look at this, you can see it doesn't look exactly how we were expecting. And actually the reason for this is because this footage doesn't have an alpha. If I look at the alpha channel, it's black. This caught me out so many times when I was first learning Nuke, and I never really realized why it was. I was thinking, why does it look kind of dark here? And then when I merge it over, it's really light and semi-transparent. It's just because neither of these actually have an alpha, so Nuke doesn't really know how to combine them. So the easiest way to do that is just to go into the read node and turn on auto alpha here. This will add an alpha channel to the read node. As you can see, it's now white. And it also means that the patch will now have its own little alpha from the roto that we drew, and when you merge them together, it will know to use that little section of the alpha to go over the top of the footage. And now, as you can see, they merge together perfectly. And because it's tracked, it should theoretically hold up for pretty much the entire shot. But here lies the problem with using a freeze frame. If I go later in the shot like here, you can see that we actually start to be able to see the patch. That's because the lighting conditions have changed a bit, and this is frame held on one frame, so it's basically freezing the lighting conditions in this position. So later on, if the lighting changes, it's going to cause problems. You could add a grade node and animate this to get brighter and darker, but that's a bit of a faff. There is a much easier way to do this, and it's essentially to just take the pixels next to it and transform them over the top for every frame. There's a node that does this all in one. In Nuke, it's called the transform masked node. I'm just going to delete all of this stuff because this isn't actually useful anymore. I'm going to take the transform mask node, plug it in here. Then what we want to do is add a roto node and just draw a shape for the tracking marker again. Then I'm going to take the triangle on the side of the transform mask, which is the mask input, and plug it into the roto. And then in the settings inside the transform mask node, if I start to turn this down, you can see it's going to shift those pixels over in the x-axis. There's also a little transform widget thing that you can use here to do it with your mouse. And again, if I add a blur node under the roto and turn up the feathering a bit, this disappears nicely. But if I move around now, you can see that this doesn't stick on. It only applies in that frame at the moment on 189. So what we have to do is apply the tracking onto the roto. It's really easy to do that. Just plug the tracker in under the blur. And this is what I was saying about having the reference frame being the same. At the moment, this reference frame is still set to the first frame, but I drew this roto on frame 189. So actually what I want to do is go into the tracker, go to the transform tab, and set my reference frame to the current frame, which is 189. And again, now if I scrub through, you can see the tracking marker disappears throughout the entire shot. But the difference between this and the first one is for every frame, it's taking the pixels next to it and moving it over. So even when the lighting conditions change, it's still taking the pixels from next to it on that frame, so it stays consistent throughout the entire shot. This is usually my favorite method for getting rid of tracking markers in 2D. It also means you don't have to worry about the grain, because the grain is preserved by doing this as well. After this, it would just be rinse and repeat, so I would track all of them and do the same thing. The next method I'm going to show is using the 3D camera track, which I did in the previous video. The beauty of doing it in 3D is you only have to do one track, so you track the camera once, and then you can project that cleanup onto some geometry and it will just stick in the shot, which is really cool. So how do we do this? The first thing I'm going to do is take the card I created in the last video. I'm going to duplicate it, which you can do by pressing Alt-C. That's a shortcut to duplicate nodes. And I'm going to plug this into the checkerboard as well. Then what I'm going to do is add something called a scene node. A scene node basically works as like a folder, so you can plug in lots of geometry to it and then look at the node and it will show you all of the geometry at once. Whereas at the moment I can't view these two together, I just have to look at them individually. So if I plug in both of these cards into the scene node and then look at it, you can see they both show up. And then basically what I want to do is rotate this second card 90 degrees so that it lines up with this back wall. So to do that, I'm going to hit tab while my mouse is over the viewer to go into the 3D viewport. I'm going to click on the second card node, and if I hold down Control, it will give you this rotation widget, which I can then use to spin it around like this. Then I can just push it back in Z space until it lines up with the back of the first card. I should probably have mentioned that to move around in the 3D viewport, you use the middle mouse button and then click and drag to move around. You can hold Control and then just click and drag, which will allow you to rotate around, and then you just use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. So once that card is lined up, I'm going to take the object input from the scanline render and plug it into the second card instead. I'm going to get rid of the first one now, don't really need it. And then I can just shift this card over until it's overlaying on the tracking markers. Then the next thing I'm going to do is add a rotopaint node. Again, the shortcut for that is P. Plug the rotopaint node into the footage. Then again, I'm going to use the clone tool. I'm going to drop the opacity down to about 0.1 and just paint out all of these tracking markers. When there's light gradients like this, where it goes from light to dark, painting is usually quite difficult to get the gradient exactly right. What you can do is use the blur brush a little bit to just blur it. Because we're going to be reapplying grain onto this afterwards, it doesn't really matter so much that we're smudging the texture, because the grain will bring back some of that crispness. So that looks pretty good. Then I'm going to frame hold this so that the painting doesn't just disappear after one frame. And now what I want to do is add a project 3D node. The project 3D node basically takes the 2D input and projects it through the camera's view onto the geometry. So if I take this input and plug it into the footage that I've just painted, and then I take the input for the camera and plug this into the camera, then I want to take the card that we made in 3D space and plug this underneath the project 3D node. And then the object/scene input for the scanline render goes back into the geometry, so the card again. And if I just make a bit more space for this, it should look something like this. The only problem now is the cleanup is done on frame 255, so we want it to always be projected on frame 255. So what we actually want to do is freeze the projection camera on that frame. So it's basically like deleting all the other keyframes. The camera will just hold still and always project it from that position. And I can show that by looking at this in 3D. If you imagine the camera is literally a projector, as you can see when it's moving, the picture is moving as well. What we really want to do is have a version of the camera that doesn't move, that stays projecting this in the same place for the entire time in 3D space. And then a second camera will come along and film it while it's frozen in 3D space. So to do that, what we can do is disconnect the frame hold node by pressing Ctrl-Shift-X and just plug it in underneath the project 3D instead. And if you follow the flow of the node graph, basically what we can see is happening now is the cleanup is being frame held and also the projection camera is being frame held, because the frame hold is underneath these two nodes. But then the scanline render is actually going straight to the camera, so it's bypassing the frame hold. And this means when it gets round to rendering it from the camera's perspective, it's actually using the moving camera. So now if I look at the merge node, we should see this is pretty much sticking to the wall. You can see the edge of the projection kind of here. Obviously this isn't ideal, but what we're really looking for is that the wall is sticking in the right place and the tracking markers are being covered throughout the entire shot, which they are. So now, just like the 2D version, we basically just want to draw some masks over the areas of the tracking markers so we can cut them out. So I'm going to go back to frame 225. I'm going to turn off the rotopaint node for now by pressing D, and then I'm going to add another roto node and just draw some shapes around the bits of the tracking markers. Then just like last time, I'm going to add a merge node, plug this in underneath the cleanup, then the A input goes into the roto, and we set the merge operation to mask. Add another blurred node which will soften the edges of the patches slightly, and then if I turn the rotopaint node back on, the tracking markers disappear and we're left just with the patches of the cleanup. Then this gets run through the whole setup, so it goes through the project 3D and the frame hold, that gets put on the geometry, and then if we look at the eventual output from the scanline render, you can see we have the patches of the tracking markers moving in 3D space, and when they get merged on top of the footage, you can see the tracking markers have magically disappeared throughout the entire shot. And if I toggle that on and off, you can see them disappearing. Now again, like I mentioned in the 2D one, because this is frozen on one frame, the grain currently isn't moving on those patches. So what you would want to do is go back in and add some grain onto these patches so they match better with the rest of the footage. There's a node for matching grain in Nuke that's really good called f_regrain. You plug the source into the cleanup, so this is going to go into the scanline render, and then there's a second input for grain, and this is for sampling the grain from the original footage. You just want to do this on one frame, so I'm going to add a frame hold node and plug this into the footage, doesn't matter what frame it's on, and then I'm going to take the grain input from the f_regrain, plug it into the frame hold, and then if I click on the regrain node, it gives me this box which is for sampling the grain. You want to move this over an area that's fairly flat in color and has some grain in it, obviously. Usually areas of the frame that are quite dark are quite good because they tend to have more grain on them, obviously. I'm going to go for this corner down here because it's fairly dark and a uniform color. And now if we look at the regrain node, you should be able to see that it's applying some grain onto the patches. So then if I take the A input and move it from the scanline render to the regrain node, this should now be working. There's a few controls in the regrain node for the size and amount of the grain. I usually turn the amount down to about 0.7 or 0.8. Usually 1 is a little bit too much, but obviously do it based on how it looks in the shot for you. And there we go. Those are a few really common techniques for doing 2D and 3D cleanup in Nuke. Hopefully this video has been helpful. Make sure you check out all the other videos in this playlist. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.